Hello, everyone. How are y'all doing today? Y'all are good? Good. Well, welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Sydney. I'm a bookseller here where we now host in-person events along with virtual events, partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. For a full list of everything that we're doing right now, please go to our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you all to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. We've lifted the mask mandate here in the store, but if you would like to wear a mask, we can provide one for you. We have them up at the front, near the front entrance. When we get to the time for opening the floor for questions, we've placed a standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right. Please line up at one of these mics so that everyone can hear your question. We want the question to be heard in our recording of the event. So we're live streaming today's program so that anyone can find it on our Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing up here at this table, so if you haven't already purchased the book, we have plenty of copies behind the registers at the front of the store. We'll ask you to line up starting at that pillar as well. We'll come by, ask your name for personalization, so please have your books ready for us. And then once the event is complete, if you could keep your chairs where they are, we have some other events happening today. And now I am super excited to welcome Tamika Nunley, celebrating the release of The Demands of Justice, Enslaved Women, Capital Crime, and Clemency in Early Virginia. Tamika Nunley is an associate professor of history at Cornell University, whose teaching and research focuses on the history of slavery, African American women and gender history, the early republic, and the American Civil War. Her first book, At the Threshold of Liberty, Women, Slavery, and Shifting Identities in Washington, D.C., was named the 2021 Letitia Woods Brown Book Prize winner for Best Book in African American Women's History, and the 2021 Pauli Murray Prize Book Prize winner for Best Book in Black Intellectual History. Nunley will be joined in conversation with Marcia Chatelain. Chatelain is an American academic who serves as a professor of history and African American studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. In 2021, she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for History for her book Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, which also won a James Beard Award. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose Tamika Nunley and Marcia Chatelain.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Why don't we give another round of applause to Dr. Nunley on the successful publication of her book. It is such a pleasure to be here to talk about another outstanding book that you've written.
Thanks.
I was on the prize committee for
Really?
Yes, for your first
wow.
book. So
Oh, thank you.
so
Thank
I
you.
am familiar, and I want to start with something. I know authors hate this because you're like, oh God, I have to hear my book again. But this is so profound that I wanted to make sure that the audience understands the depth of this study. At the end of chapter 1 of your book, when you're laying out the relationship among enslaved women, capital crime, and clemency in early Virginia, you talk about luxury. And I think this is a really fascinating place to start. And actually, why don't I just ask you, when we think about the study of slavery, we often lose sight of what slavery facilitates, not only for the economy and not only for the families that are entwined in it, but also for the law. And so I want to start out by asking, why start with this question of luxury?
It started off with this image that if some of you all have the book, there's an image of a painting of a gentleman who is a white man. He looks like he's from the Chesapeake. And he looks kind of like a standard, that's Stephanie, we went to high school together, of a man who looks like a proper Virginia gentleman from the 18th century. That's sort of what it depicts. But on the back of the actual canvas is a depiction of this man being with a black woman and also beating an enslaved man. And so I thought that, in the title of the painting is Virginian Luxuries. And I thought that there's a particular kind of cultural work that slavery does for shaping American identity, and particularly early American identity, and what does it mean to be genteel, what does it mean to be legitimate, right, in this sort of early American landscape. And a lot of that has to do with the exploitation of labor and being able to use that labor to facilitate the creation of American culture, and ideas about prosperity and ideas about what it means to become socially and economically mobile, and the ways in which that's very much hinged upon the exploitation of these enslaved people and enslaved women in particular, when we think about the reproductive labor that they perform for this population of laborers, right?
One of the things that you do early in the book in the introduction is you pay homage to all the incredible scholars of slavery that came before you that set up the frameworks. But one of the things that I think you also point to is how few books or how few studies really think about the ways that black women and girls, particularly when they're brought into the legal system, how they also inform our ideas about slaveholding and nation. Mm-hmm. And so of all the kind of various entry points into the study of slavery, particularly in Virginia, why did you decide on this framework to tell this story?
I thought justice was an important framework to think about because of the ways that clemency worked. So I was looking at these court cases. I was actually working in Prince William County, Virginia, and looking at the courthouse, and we were trying to tell the story of an enslaved woman who was accused of murdering her master, her enslaver, and the executive office of Virginia was trying to decide on whether or not to consider clemency. And I was like, wow, clemency, that's a very interesting legal technology for, a time in which slavery, right, is thriving and slavery is authorized by the law. And so I was like, what does clemency look like for an enslaved person, right? When we think about clemency, we think about someone who's immediately, sort of made sort of acquitted of these charges and in some ways are seen as innocent. And I found that clemency doesn't look that way for enslaved women and girls, that the best possible case scenario is that if they are convicted for a capital crime and they are granted executive clemency from the governor, that they would be sold outside of the state of Virginia to another enslaver. And so it very much complicates our contemporary ideas about clemency, which we seem to think of as a benevolent feature. But clemency in this case is very much tied to commitments to slavery, and also to the financial interests of enslavers throughout the state. And what's interesting is that the state of Virginia compensates enslavers for those enslaved people who are sold, but also for enslaved people who are executed. And so if they're executed, then the governor of Virginia will compensate an enslaver for the full market price and value of that enslaved person, right? And so then what is justice under such a system? And I wrote this book during the pandemic when people were protesting. And when we were marching and protesting, I was kind of thinking, like, what are we doing here? What is the work of protest doing? And in a lot of ways, you're marching because there's something insufficient about the justice system as it exists, that people are marching with their feet to say that we need the system to do more than what it's doing. And so I began to question, how long have people been doing that? How long have people been sort of asking and posing questions about the access and scope and reach of justice?
There's a kind of conventional wisdom when we think about the system of slavery that enslaved people are completely outside of the law. Mm-hmm. But what you're saying, no, they're actually fundamental for our understanding of the law, because these gestures of clemency or, what we would say judicial benevolence are also in the service of suggesting something about the institution, right? So that if the institution can provide this thing they call justice, then the institution can't be contrary to the system of democracy. And with each chapter, you kind of walk us through the different types of crimes that enslaved women and girls were charged with. And the second chapter is about poison, which is so fascinating because there's a long history of poisoning being associated as a feminized crime because it's about being able to poison food, right? Or to make someone more ill in their care. And so how did the poisoning cases, how did they unfold in the courts?
You know, poison is oftentimes hard to prove. And so oftentimes, right, enslaved women, whether or not they actually did poison someone or attempt to poison someone, are immediately targeted if an enslaver doesn't feel well or feels as though they've been made ill from something that they've consumed. But what's also interesting is what it shows us about the botanical knowledge, the knowledge that enslaved women and girls possess, and that knowledge and how it's passed down over time, right? And so what I also saw, in addition to them being accused of being of sort of trying to poison their enslavers, I also saw generations of women passing down knowledge about foraging and about finding, you know, medicinal properties through plants, right, and creating their own sort of healing economies as well. So sometimes these women and girls were charged with care for children and would have to administer medicine. And if they administered that medicine, that came with great risk, not because they were trying to be super aggressive and violent, oftentimes because early American medicine was super underdeveloped.
No one was washing their hands.
No one was washing their hands. You know, we had heroic medicine, you know, and, you know, honestly, I don't want a 19th century doctor treating me because they'll bleed you. They do this bleeding out thing. And I'm like, I'm all set. Like, I'll just, you know, eat a couple herbs, right? And so, you know, so that medical industry is not as developed as you might think. And so a doctor could have been responsible, right, for the poison of an enslaver and their family, but oftentimes because of the gendered nature of enslaved women and girls' labor in the household, they were often deemed sort of the primary suspects for these kinds of crimes. And then there are instances in which they really did poison enslavers, right? And they were very intentional about it. I remember one story of an elderly woman named Lovelace, and this elderly woman was clearly someone important in the enslaved community. And so these two enslaved people came to her and said, we want something to put on our enslaver because the man said, I want to make him love me because he keeps beating me and I just don't know why, right? And the woman involved said, I just want to take care of him. I just want to take him out, right? And so Lovelace is like, all right, I got some hair, got little pieces of glass, got a little bit of this, a little dash of that. And so they go and try to give it to him, and she catches them, or the enslaver catches them, and they end up going to trial. And so these people talk about how he was a very hard master, right, and how he continued, you know, to beat them mercilessly, right, and no matter how hard they tried to do what was right and what was expected of them. And so they end up being convicted for attempted poison. But what's interesting is that the enslaver and people in the community said, but Lovelace, we don't touch her. Like, we're all set. We don't need to convict her. And I think that's actually really powerful, right? Because it shows us that there's a completely different social economy that even, right, the white people in the county have to acknowledge and also observe, right? And there's something about the cosmologies that she possesses about spirituality and about poison that they want no parts of, right? They think it's actually going to be a greater consequence to try to convict Lovelace. And so they're like, we're going to just leave her alone. Like, we're not messing with Lovelace, right?
Well, this is what I think is a really fascinating feature of these anecdotes you provide. So again, if we're to believe that, you know, Black people are not in this judicial system, people are talking about them in the judicial system. They're being tried in these kind of weird proceedings, and then their appeals, and then it goes up to the governor. And so, you know, it's interesting to think about, in terms of your archival research. Were you stunned by the volume of cases that you were able to find?
I absolutely was. When I found the first case, which was of Agnes in the murder chapter, I thought, oh, this must be an anomaly, right? And so I started talking to other scholars, and they were like, well, there's actually quite a few interesting cases. And then I began to go county by county through all the court dockets, and I just started to see a volume of activity, activity that oftentimes is attributed to men, right? When we think about resistance, particularly resistance that involves violence, it's oftentimes attributed to enslaved men. But what was interesting, right, was the enslaved women, the grandmothers, right, and the girls who were also involved in this activity. And I wanted to sort of tease out sort of the scope of it to try to understand what was happening. And what I found out is that on the ground, there are community mores that shape justice, ideas about right and wrong, that shaped the outcome of cases, right? And so if an enslaved woman was being considered for clemency, it was because white citizens of the county petitioned the governor to say, we do not want to execute this person. There is some contextual components to this story that you need to understand. And so it showed the ways in which the law, right, is very localized, as scholars like Lord Edwards have shown, right, that the local mores, particularly of the South, oftentimes shaped what justice could look like.
And one of the points that you hit home beautifully is that there's kind of interdependence among people, right? They're in close proximity. There's a lot of intimacy, but there's also this idea there has to be discipline and boundaries.
Yes.
And it continues to shift. And in the chapter about murder, this also becomes a place where you talk about how, if we think about murder as the kind of most egregious capital crime, we also have to consider that the other capital crimes, right, are theft, running away. There's a wide umbrella of transgressions that people can commit that are considered, worth their life. And murder is one of many, but they have to parse it out. And so when you were looking at the cases of murder, how did people kind of rationalize or try to understand or contextualize these cases, especially when they involved women?
I think in a lot of ways there's sort of what happens in the press, right? And so newspapers like in Alexandria and Washington, D.C. would see this appear in sort of the court records and say, this is what's happening, and kind of make their own sort of judgments and assumptions about what happened. But it's really these petitions that give you the bigger story, that start to tell you what was actually happening on that plantation and what led an enslaved woman to commit that crime. And what you see is really devastating stories about just years and years of sadistic violence that kind of brought them to the brink, to the edge, where they just said no more, right? And so that chapter, right, is a chapter of escalation in a lot of ways, right, where you begin to just see even a grandmother, Nellie. I start that chapter off with a woman named Nellie, who's a grandmother, and she says she gets her children and her grandchildren and other people involved, and they're like, we taking this man out today. Right, and she says in the record, she was like, we just got tired of him. We decided to get rid of him. We were tired, right? And like, we can't even begin to fathom what it means for her to be tired. Here she has birthed generations of people that have made this man wealthy, and this man has continued to make their life unbearable. And she just says, this is it, right? And it just really underscores the degree to which slavery was really the system that really posed an ethical challenge to the legal system, right? Because no matter how much they try to present slavery as a positive good, there were these actions that are evident in the court document of enslaved people that saying absolutely not, right? and
also, these are not people who become abolitionists by any stretch of the imagination. They're people who are very much committed to the system, but they can't rationalize it.
Yep, absolutely.
And in thinking about, the press, or in terms of sources, in terms of the reporting, what were the chilling effects of a story about an attempted murder or a successful murder? How does then that impact a broader audience that reads about it?
It's very interesting because it has a chilling effect, right, when it appears in the Alexandria Gazette or if it appears in the National Intelligencer. People are like, what's going on in Accomack County? What's going on in Prince William County? And then county citizens are like, wait a minute, this isn't us. This isn't who we are, right? And this is where you start to see the petitions emerge, like, grant this woman mercy, because this is not reflective. This enslaver and his brutality, her brutality is not reflective of the community and what we represent, right? And so you begin to see these sort of broader contestations that actually don't focus on the enslaved people who are being actually, criminalized by the system, but it actually becomes about understanding the locale on the locale's terms. And so there's that dynamic happening, but initially what brings them all together and in conversation is the actions of these enslaved women and girls, right? And that they have to contend with, and they know they have to contend with the realities on the ground.
There's a way that, this book kind of forces us to think about white benevolence in this era and self-preservation. What were the ways that people were explicit about the consequences, right? If this execution were to go forward, then therefore what about us? Because it doesn't necessarily destabilize the power or the extent to which people can exercise power. Why did anyone care?
People cared because they felt like this politics of place informed who they were, right? It implicated them, right? And so when you see these petitions and when they appear before the court to give testimony, they're trying to also create distance between themselves and the enslaver, who is sort of contextualized as being particularly cruel. And they're trying to say that's not what we represent, right? And so them coming to court to defend an enslaved person has less to do with the enslaved person, right? Has everything to do with being able to say, this is not us, this is not me, right? This is not who we are. This guy is an anomaly, right? And so grant this woman clemency, right? And so that we can sort of represent the best and the highest virtues of justice in Virginia.
And when you talked earlier about clemency, you talked about the practice of selling people out, right, of the state. How did that practice then kind of shape, ideas about punishment even after the end of slavery? Because there's something really that I found particularly illuminating about it when we think about kind of policies today where people are concerned about family members, community members who are sent far away as at the terms of their incarceration, right? Because I think that twists the knife even further. You're not only punished, but now you're alienated from people who are familiar. So how did that kind of legal structure of sending people out of the state and then the compensation work?
On a macro level, right, the legal system is committed to ensuring that the financial investment in an enslaved person is protected at all costs, period, right? And so if you're executed, Virginia is going to compensate for that execution. If you're sold, Virginia is going to make sure that money goes to your pocket, right? But even if you are proven, right, to be innocent and worthy of clemency, right, your economic exploitation is going to be perpetuated through the system, right? So that's the limits of justice. That's what justice allows for in Virginia. But then also, right, there are different ideas about clemency, right? And so one of the things I wanted to highlight was sort of Black people's own ideas, their own epistemologies around justice, right? And this idea that clemency was benevolent. It was benevolent as it was defined by lawmakers and by the judges, right, who were overseeing these cases. But it was not benevolent, right, to your point, to the enslaved person who was now going to be sold away from their family, even though they knew, right, they've provided context as to why things happened the way that they did. And so even though this is seen as like a benevolent feature by jurists and lawmakers to the enslaved person, clemency does not seem like a benevolent feature. And those are very competing ideas that have shaped the historical literature about the law in Virginia in early America, right? So many historians before before our generation, would talk about how because clemency is a legal technology that early American people use, that they care deeply about justice, right? And that, it's not all one, it's not, slavery was not without, right, considerations of justice, right?
Yeah.
And so it's trying to sort of add this veneer of like these people were really thinking deeply about, and I'm sure they were thinking very deeply about it, and what they arrived at was the continued exploitation.
Yeah. Isn't that
bondage,
interesting?
right? And so there's a politics even to the production of this history that has influenced how contemporary thinkers even think about the past and think about what the law does. And then when we even think about the 13th Amendment and the loophole of right convict leasing and criminalizing and exploiting convicts and exploiting their labor, right? You see, right, that there's a historical precedent, right? And so, in some ways, we are not steered clear of this era and its implications.
One of the crimes that you also write about, so sensitively, is infanticide.
Yes.
And the ways that infanticide appears, again, a highly gendered crime in the courts. How were the courts grappling with that specific kind of crime relative to the realities of the reproductive value that Black women and girls had to the system of slavery?
I found that in cases of infanticide, this is where you see the legal system really fumbling through these kinds of cases for several reasons. The first reason is that, again, the medical industry, obstetrics and gynecology, is not highly developed at this time. So it's really difficult to definitively say, that an enslaved woman intentionally killed a child, right, or aborted a fetus. And the second issue, right, is the economic value tied to the reproductive work of pregnancy, right? And so when you're trying the case and you're trying to figure out whether or not this enslaved woman did this and the nature of it, it's tied to compensation, right? And so if the baby is a casualty in a crime, right, then it could qualify for compensation from the state of Virginia. And so it was really important. Enslavers were very invested in trying to figure these crimes out, right, and trying to figure out whether or not this woman was responsible. And then there are other things at work too. Again, community mores come back in as factors of shaping an outcome of a case. Some enslaved girls, right, were known for having sort of respectable reputations in which they presented themselves in a particular way that made it very, very surprising to the community that they were even pregnant, right? But here at work is also a denial of the sexual exploitation that happens during slavery, right? You're surprised, but you know that the law allows for the sexual violation of enslaved women, right? That enslaved women and girls are not deemed legally rapeable at this time.
And you close out the book, and I think everyone's going to buy the book, and you should especially buy it for this last chapter, because you talk about the way that the Civil War period opens up this question of insurgency and protection from a state of sorts in wartime. And it's so brilliantly written. And I also think that for folks who are, who've lived in D.C. a long time, from D.C., interested in D.C. history, these ideas of D.C. as a space of emancipation, I think also forces you to read it even more carefully. But tell us, there are a lot of ways you could have ended this book. And, as a writer, you end the book when you just can't take it anymore.
Yes, that's right.
But, but I think in many ways, the Civil War chapter is it's calling us back to your first book and about, this idea of what is happening in this period of time where anything could happen to the state.
Yes.
There could be two nations. There could be only one nation. There could be, So can you help us understand how enslaved women and girls understood this new political terrain that they were living in during wartime.
Absolutely. They totally exploited it, right? And things really blow up in smoke, particularly in places like Richmond. When you even look at photographs of Richmond after the Civil War, right, it's completely demolished in a lot of ways. And they were there. They were there to witness it. One of the things that I always tell people is that as a historian, we are trained to sort of see moments like the Civil War as these really important signposts, these watershed moments along sort of a broader chronology of American history. As someone who's also trained in Black studies, I'm also trained to be able to see that Black liberation is happening along sort of a broader struggle. Like, we still struggling, right? So we still in that liberation struggle right now as we speak. And so if I put those two things together, then it makes sense that the Civil War becomes this moment of insurgency. Not only insurgency, this is not an insurgency that catches enslaved people off guard. This is an insurgency they've been waiting for, right? This is precisely the kinds of moment, right, that they're waiting for. Same thing with the American Revolution and with the War of 1812, right? Whenever there is a conflict, Black folks are ready, and they're trying to figure out, okay, how can we strategically navigate this in ways that work in our favor? But also, it's about their politics, right? They have a politics about freedom, about liberation that Congress, right, and that Lincoln catch up to, right? And then it really sort of shifts our thinking about the Emancipation Proclamation, not sort of being this gesture, this benevolent gesture, this patronizing gesture. It's one that's enforced and reinforced by the politics of Black people on the ground, and particularly refugee people, enslaved people, who are trying to figure out how to navigate this moment. And so we see ruptures. We see ruptures all throughout households in Virginia, from the rural regions right into the urban areas of Richmond and Petersburg. You see enslaved women and girls lighting houses on fire, taking Confederate notes, even though they're not worth that much by the end of the war, right? Taking clothing, right? Making plans to reunite with loved ones who they know have been hired out in other parts of the state, right? They're making plans. They're setting their anti-slavery politics in motion, but those politics have been percolating from the beginning of this book, right?
And in wartime, what's the value of the courts?
Yes, yeah. And then the courts, right, they're very much cognizant of the fact that the Confederacy is engaged in this political project that's not yet fully developed. It's not yet fully cooked, right? They're trying to make claims to sovereignty that the Union is not recognizing, right? And in some ways, they see themselves as being subject to a Union government, right? A Union sovereignty, and discredit, right, efforts of the Confederacy to establish a court system. And even the people running the courts in the Confederacy, right, are just very sort of confused and unclear at times as to how to navigate these issues as well. They're not as inclined to sell enslaved people outside of Virginia, because we don't know what's going to happen to the value of enslaved people if we move them outside of Virginia, away from the center and the seat of the Confederacy. They might lose their value. They might run away. They might get in contact with Union soldiers. And so their strategies that they've been using prior to the war are no longer applicable in the same way, and they have to also innovate on a case-by-case basis. And enslaved women and girls are forcing them to have to do that work on a case-by-case basis.
Before we open it up to the audience, there are two contemporary issues that I want to ask you about. The first is about, the ongoing conversation about reparations. And one of the ways that we've seen, I shouldn't say added nuance, but one dimension of the conversation that I think people are more likely to introduce in this conversation is the compensatory nature of the post-Civil War era, right? That people were not left kind of completely destitute after the end of slavery. But you're making a very compelling argument about the ways that the courts reified the system of slavery through these convictions. How do you think that your scholarship, again, adds more dimension or more specificity in the ways that we talk about reparations?
Yeah, I think that what we see is Virginia, the oldest slaveholding state, right, in the nation, keeping very, very good record of sort of the exchange, the financial transactions that have been shaping, right, the sale of enslaved people. And what's interesting is that Virginia, as a state, as a government, is very involved in protecting the economic interests of enslavers. And so it's interesting that we kind of take this hands-off approach about reparations, right? Because it's like, grappling with people who are saying, well, it's just impossible for the government to, be involved in that process and, the bureaucratic nature of it. But when it came to slavery, right, the government was more than happy to be involved, right, in the economics of slavery and extraction and exploitation, right, and all of our financial institutions as well. And so just as those institutions and the government can be mobilized in the effort to enslave, right, the government, right, financial institutions, right, can also be mobilized to other ends, right? And so we have the imagination to be able to do that, right? If we've had the imagination to do this in a different context for several centuries, surely today, right, we do as well.
I mean, it really kind of puts some, it puts a filter or an understanding of, or even conceptualization of victims' rights, victims' compensation, like what you are owed when you're harmed by the state or by a private entity. And so I thought that was really, really fascinating. And then the last thing I want to ask you about, recently you published a Made by History essay in the Washington Post called The Danger of Today's Jurisprudence Reproducing Slavery's Ideas in a case involving the legal definition of embryos, right?
Yes.
And I thought that was such a powerful essay, not only because it provided a history lesson, but it also shows the ways that the institution of slavery still continues to inform a lot of our ideas. Can you talk a little bit about, why you weighed in on that case in this particular moment?
We are living in a time where it's kind of hard to keep up with all of the alarming things that are happening in the law, in society, and politics. But it was one of those things. I was just reading the news, and I saw that this case had been decided, or not decided, but a preliminary opinion had been issued by a Virginia court about whether or not to determine that an embryo between a divorced couple could be divided as property, be treated as property. And the preliminary opinion cited 3 different slave laws to say that that these embryos could be considered human property, right? And so,
and just the term human property, I mean,
yes,
that is so alarming in 2023 for that framework to then be presented as an argument in a case. But continue.
Absolutely. And I just, I kind of looked around like, did anybody else see that this happened?
Because we don't define children as human property in those
exactly.
terms. So.
So I just thought, this is getting really dystopian really fast, right? And I normally don't even write op-eds, but I was like, I got to say something about this, because if we are relying on the legal precedent of, antebellum slave laws, what are we doing? Like, what are we doing? And it's incredibly harmful. And so throughout that piece, I sort of map out sort of how we got here, right, and sort of the ways in which, particularly the bodies of Black women and girls, have been subject to all of these sort of legal innovations that perpetuate their reproductive exploitation, that perpetuate reproductive violence. And I argue that with new reproductive technologies, we need new laws. Is that too much to ask? Right? We just need new laws. We don't need to use the laws of slavery and apply them to new reproductive technologies. I really believe in our intellectual abilities to do better. and so we have to find a different way. And it's going to be tricky because of the ways that reproductive debates are sort of unfolding across the political spectrum. It's going to be tricky, but it needs to be done, and it's urgent.
Well, with that, I just want to say thank you so much for writing such an incredible book.
Thank you
and
for reading.
I'd like to open it up to the audience after we give another round of applause. Is there a roving? Oh, there's a microphone right up front. If you could use it so that the folks online and the recording can capture your comments. Yes.
Thank you so much. It's very illuminating.
Thank you.
I think Mary Chestnut mentions somebody getting poisoned, I think. So you could see that during the war, the white owners like, oh my gosh, this is, But I had two questions. One is that you kind of touched on this. I'd love it if you give us a sense of, did you get a sense of the slave view of justice? Obviously they had their own system that they had to kind of work with. Time to take action, right? And then the other question was about when you mentioned I'm just curious what the environment looked like when you were appealing. So you mentioned that there were other whites who were concerned about their image or whatever, but were there advocates, or in other words, how would a case work its way up to the governor? Were there advocates on each side, or was it just these whites in the community? So, thank you.
Oftentimes it was a petitioner, right? And these petitions would have the signatures of up to 70 to 100 county residents who were petitioning in favor of clemency. And so what it shows us is that there were relationships on the ground that also mattered to these people, whether there were relationships in which they viewed the enslaved person in a positive light, or whether it was a relationship in which they viewed the enslaver in a negative light, right? And so those dynamics were very complex and very specific to the locale. And in terms of appealing cases, right, it's really the voices of white citizens that are given the weight and the currency to be able to work its way up the legal system. An enslaved person could not take their enslaver to court for the kind of violence that they experienced, right? And so one of the things I point out is that discipline and punishment is not only executed in the courts and in prison, right, and in jail. Discipline and punishment is executed on the plantation, which is also a site of carcerality, right, a site of imprisonment and bondage. And so if that enslaver failed to execute that discipline in a way that was palatable to the local community, then the local community would make the governor aware of it, right? And so there are these dynamics around the law that we oftentimes in our contemporary sort of framework don't always appreciate. Even sort of the birth of the police, right, is very much rooted in sort of a citizen policing, a citizen executing of the law, right? And so this is sort of a legal culture that sometimes feels foreign to us, and sometimes, unfortunately, it doesn't when it happens and sort of manifests in these tragic ways. And your first question was about enslaved people's ideas about justice. Yes, absolutely. So the record really doesn't privilege the testimonies of enslaved people, but where I have found it, right, oftentimes it was enslaved women and girls who just said, I could not take it anymore, right? And to me, I find that to be a particular kind of politics of justice, to say that there is a moral economy of right and wrong that they possess, that they articulate, that they've been formulating for many years, that they've passed down through the generations, that says this is wrong, this is not right. And that their set of responses and reactions give us a window, give us a portrait of what justice could be, right? And even when we think about the long arc of justice in American society, right? People protest, people organize, right, to realize a level of democracy, of justice that is not yet realized as it's sort of structured presently, right? And so this is a part of a broader tradition, right, of being able to say that the scope and the reach of justice needs to stretch further.
Were there any biblical references, for instance?
Yeah, there are biblical references, and maybe not in this book, but that other scholars have used to talk about, right, Exodus, talk about sort of there being a theological and a sort of a higher way, a higher plane of understanding justice that it does not exist in English common law in sort of our state statutes.
Hello.
Hi.
Sorry. Thank you so much for all your scholarship. My husband and I devoured your first book, and we're really excited to feast on this one. I'm from Spotsylvania, Virginia,
yes.
so the history of slavery runs through me. I grew up with it.
Yes.
I also grew up with, there's a church still there, Waller's Baptist Church.
Mm-hmm.
My home church, we fellowship with them, but we broke away from them after the Civil War. That this is the same Waller's family that enslaved Kunta Kinte. And I really appreciate you putting out literature, scholarship that proves that we did not accept this state that we were forced into, that there was always active resistance, sometimes to the point of violence when it was always, I feel, necessary.
Yeah.
When it comes to going into these records, was it difficult to uncover some of them? Like you talked about, you found some newspapers, able to track it back that way, but are there, especially in rural parts of Virginia, how hard is it to access those records? How many of them are digitized? And I'm sure you had tons of stories that you uncovered. What is one that you just couldn't squeeze it into the book, if you could share?
Oh, wow. Oftentimes the ones that I can't put in the book are the ones where I don't have enough information, right? There's not enough for me to work with, and I don't have the creative chops yet to be able to make something out of them. But a lot of those records were at the Library of Virginia, which is a really wonderful place to study because they also have the local history section where the genealogists, who are the true heroes of Virginia history, right, have done extensive work to document a lot of records that have actually been burned in courthouses and are lost over time. And so in that way, it was very, very difficult. But and then in terms of like even just the emotional toll of looking at those records, I mean, I think by the time I got to infanticide, I was like, we got to finish writing this book because I think I'm done writing this book. And it was during the pandemic. It was when we were all on lockdown. And so it was lots of things happening where I just really had to sit silently with these records. But, you know, to see, particularly there was one case that I wasn't able to include because I didn't have a lot of information of a 9-year-old girl who was accused of infanticide. And at the time, my daughter was 9 years old, and I just, you know, I sat with that, and it was really, really challenging, right? Because it was clear from what evidence that I did have, right, that she did not consent, right, to any sexual activity that led to this, right? That she was the victim of sexual violence, of cruelty. Right, and that she was now forced and expected to have this child and continue to fuel the coffers of her enslaver. And it's moments like that that you really begin to understand what these laws have allowed for, what their implications are, and just the stakes of doing this history and uncovering stories, you know. And so, like, please continue to uncover the stories from Spotsylvania. Like, we need them, right? Because it helps us understand where we are. It helps us understand our history. It helps us understand the work that still has yet to be done.
Thank you. And please practice as much self-care as you need so you can write another book for us to enjoy. Thank you.
I think we have room for a couple more questions if there are any. Yes.
So I'm not a lawyer, but
Me neither.
yeah, and I know that there are state laws and federal laws. So do the state laws that assume enslavement continue to function after slavery is abolished? Or no? What happens? I mean, they have all these statutes that go back when.
I'm trying to figure this out because of this case that I wrote about this week, right? You know, what are the statute of limitations, particularly on slave codes, and how does the 13th Amendment, right, prevent this judge from using these laws? But the question is not whether or not these embryos are enslaved. The question is whether or not these embryos can be considered human property.
Well, that's still slave law. Human property, just the concept.
It is.
Yeah. So why would it even be a possibility?
Timmy. I have a friend who's a lawyer who just happens to be in the audience. Would you like to answer that question?
The sort of short response would be, you know, the statute hasn't been repealed.
Well, why not?
I think we need to ask our legislature lots of hard questions.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Isn't this the fundamental problem? This is how you get these anecdotes of, Civil Rights Act of 1964 passes, but the repeal on
Yes.
separate water fountains, the repeal on marriage, the law is really designed for a kind of durability
Yes.
that
yes.
the post-Civil War climate blows up and that we're still grappling with.
Yes.
You may say.
Yes.
No one asked me, but I've just wanted to offer
But
that.
it's true.
On that sobering but insightful note, let us thank our speaker again, and let's transition to some book signing, huh? Congratulations and thank
Marcia.
you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Tamika.